Hey everyone, welcome to another video. I hope that you're doing well. I actually recorded an intro like in front of the camera so that it could be a little bit more personable. And then I realized that the frame rate that I recorded it is completely different than the frame rate that QuickTime Player uses to record screen captures. And because this is my first time doing this, I did not know. So you're just gonna have to wait till the next video to see my face. But yeah, just welcome to another video. And as usual, I hope that you're all safe and that you're well and that your mental health is great. And so I want to jump into today's episode. Today, you're going to hear me talk quite a bit, but I really believe that there is a lot of value in the information that I'm going to share with you. Today's theme is how I process, or how I'm currently processing, my black and white photography. And that is like the main theme, but underneath the hood, right? I think that's where the really important stuff, the real value of today's video lies. Let me go ahead and share these four different concepts, as I firmly believe that this is where the true value of today's video lies, okay? All right, so here are the four things that we're going to be talking about today. One, we're going to talk about the value in analyzing the work of our favorite photographers, or analyzing our favorite photographs. And when I say analyze, that obviously includes lighting and composition and which lenses your favorite photographers use. All of that is very inspiring, and and it will teach you a lot. But today's video is specifically about post-processing. So when I talk about analyzing our favorite photographs, for today, I'm going to only refer to the post-processing, to the way that they edit, okay? Two, we're going to talk about consistency. Three, we're going to talk about how to analyze the photographs from the perspective of exposure, of contrast, and of tones, okay? We're not going to be doing color today, so we're going to get rid of all of the color just so we can focus on tones, okay? And then the next thing that I'm going to talk to you about, and I'm really excited about this, because I'm going to be explaining it in a way that I've never had anyone explain it to me in this way before. So maybe it's the first time someone explains it to you in this way. But looking at this next element in the way that I'm sharing with you is a complete game changer for me. I am going to talk to you about the almighty, the mystical, the all-powerful tone curve. And I'm going to be sharing with you two different ways of using the tone curve when it comes to these methods. And that is, one, to analyze, to measure, where you hover over and to see where your tones are falling. And then two, how to get your tones to fall exactly where you want them to, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and jump into the edit. All right, so the first thing is analyzing our favorite photographs. Recently I started analyzing my favorite photographers' work, and their black and white work specifically, and I used the tone curve to measure where their tones were falling. And so we're going to look at the tone curve slightly different than the way I learned to use the tone curve. Typically, whenever I would watch a tutorial in regards to the tone curve, the way that they would explain it to me is the bottom left here is dark, all of the shadows and the darks, and the top right here is all of the whites and the brighter parts of the picture. So if I were to lower this top part here, then I would be lowering the brighter parts of the picture. And if I would bring this up, I would be bringing up the darker parts of the picture. And then these would be the midtones. And that is the explanation that I've been given in the past. And I've been editing using the tone curve for many years under that understanding. Today, however, I'm going to share with you a completely different perspective. So we're going to forget for today, we're going to just completely forget about this line. But for measurement, we're going to use these grids here, okay? Right here. And so there's 4 grids here. We're going to call them zones, okay? So if you haven't heard of Ansel Adams' zone system, I'm going to share it with you now. This is a system when black and white photography on film was the only type of photography that you could do. I mean, you could do color stuff, but it was just very, very uncommon. So basically there's 10 zones, okay? And when you shoot black and white photography, you're basically shooting either black, white, or some type of shade of gray, right? And so there's 10 zones, and Ansel Adams determined that these zones here, this is what they pertain to. So if you wanted to get well exposed portraits or landscapes, you could use this, and then you could put stuff in there. We're not going to get into detail about this. I'm going to keep it a lot more simple, but I would encourage you to look that up if you've never, if you're not familiar with that. This can pertain to color as well. So rather than looking at it as blacks and whites, you can look at it as exposure, and this is really handy. And this really comes in handy when you are doing a photo shoot in camera. It can help you to put images in the right place. So what we're going to do now is we're going to open up the tone curve really quickly. We're going to open up the tone curve in Photoshop, and it works the same way. So you take the little hand here, and then what we're going to do is we're going to look at these 4 zones here, and we're going to look at these as the bottom here. Anything that falls in the bottom, we're going to call it blacks. Anything that falls in here, we're going to call it the darker grays. Anything that falls here, we're going to call it the lighter grays, and anything that falls here, we're going to call it whites, okay? And obviously, the higher up, the brighter it is, right? And the lower in that grid, the closer to transitioning into the following grid it'll be, okay? So if we were to look at the zone system, we see that this is pure white. Here, also white, also white. Now it's starting to get gray, right? So zone 7 is starting to like transition into the grays. And now we're in the brighter grays. And now we're here, and now we've jumped into the darker grays, and now we've jumped into the blacks, okay? So we're gonna get out of Photoshop, we're gonna come back here. So when you analyze your favorite photographs, you will take this part here, whether it be in Photoshop or Lightroom, and you are just going to look at different parts of the image. Here are the parts that I was analyzing in my favorite photographs. I would analyze the forehead, where the forehead would fall. I analyzed the side here of the forehead because sometimes this part's really bright and then this part tends to be darker. I typically like to analyze the contours, right, of the face because in a lot of the models that I shoot, this is typically darker. You can see here the forehead is up in the brighter grays, and then the contour is in the darker grays. Shirts and jeans and jackets, I like to put in the blacks. And then and also like if you look at shadows, like on the legs in this case, or the arms, or under the jawline or the chin, usually those fall close to the contour or maybe darker. And then I analyze like the back. Now, this photograph is not an example of the type of photo that you would analyze. I'm not sharing with you my favorite photographers' photos. I'm not analyzing them here. It just feels really weird to put someone else's photographs in my videos without their permission. I don't know, it just feels weird for me. So I'm not sharing this photo because I think this is like the style that we're going for. I'm sharing this with you so that you can see how you can measure your favorite photographer's work. Once you have measured enough of your favorite photographer's work, or the photographs that you like, and not just in one type of lighting, like this is a backlit photograph, right? So after looking at a lot of different backlit photographs, I know where I want to put my tones, right? Where you put your tones will determine the amount of contrast that you are going to see in your photograph, the dynamic range, and the style, okay? And that's like really, really important, okay? So if you can determine the style that you like, and you can determine typically more or less where the tones are falling in those photographs, then you are going to now have a direction, something to strive for when you edit. So I've already done that. After you do it, leave a comment below and let me know how it's working out for you. But I've already done it, so I already know I have a road map as to where I want to go with this photograph, okay? Okay, so now that we understand how how tone, how contrast and exposure contributes to certain styles that we gravitate towards, you know, because if you've been studying different photographers, then now you're going to have an idea as to the palette of tones that you want to go for. Now that we understand that, how do we get our tones to go where we want them to, right? Versus what the camera captured. So how do I put contrast in here? And not just regular contrast, but the type of contrast that will contribute to the style that I'm going for. Well, I'm going to share with you 3 different methods within Lightroom to do that. In the past, for a really long time, I would use the eyeball method. The eyeball method is just basically when you look at something and you're like, you know what, I feel like this could use a little bit more blacks, and I think I'm going to bring the shadows down. No, I don't like that. I'm going to bring that up, and I'm going to bring this down like that, and I'm going to bring the highlights, and you know what, that looks good to me. And that is the eyeball method, okay, which is good, except that from one picture to the next, it lacks consistency, and I'm not always happy with my results, okay? So instead of going with the eyeball method, what we're going to do is we are going to use these 3 different methods, and I'm going to do 3 different edits on this photograph, okay? The first one is the basic panel method. So what you do is you leave the basic panel closed, but you use the histogram up here in Lightroom. The histogram, you see, anytime I hover over anything, it highlights it gray. Okay, these pertain to a slider on the basic panel. So if I were to move this and then I open my basic panel, you can see that the slider for the blacks moved up. Okay, and let me just put that back. If I move the second one, it moves my shadows. If I move this one in the middle, it moves the exposure. This one moves the highlights, and then this one moves the whites. Okay, so I typically will leave this closed. I leave the tone curve open because it's important for me to measure, okay? So if I was going to use the basic panel method, what I would do is I would measure the forehead, and I'm like, okay, that I can live with the forehead in this area here, but I feel like we're missing a little bit of contrast, and I want to lower her shirt, and I want to lower these trees into the blacks. So the tree is like in the transitional part between, it's like right around here, and I want to lower it right around there. So I'm going to try lowering it with the blacks and maybe even the shadows a little bit. And I think I'm clipping there. Yep, I'm clipping the blacks. So I'm going to bring this back a little bit and maybe just bring the shadows down. And I'm still clipping a little bit, but I'll fix that later. Okay. All right, now I'm going to go back and I'm going to measure. And I'm like, okay, her face there is a little too dark for what I want to go for. So I'm going to bring the exposure up a tiny bit. And now let me check. So, yep, there, her skin is there. Here we have this in the blacks. The trees are still a little bright, so I'm going to bring the blacks down since I brought the exposure up. And let me look. Now we're a little bit, let's see here, we're way in the blacks there. Let me look at her leg here. So I'm going to bring the shadows down a tiny little bit. Okay. And yeah, I think this is good. I might maybe lower the whites a little bit and the highlights a tiny bit. Let me check her skin because I think that affected her skin. It dropped her skin, so I'm going to bring the exposure up a tiny little bit. And skin is good. I could go a little brighter, but I think I'm okay with that. Contour on her face is where I want it to be. Her shirt is where I want it to be. And the tree is where I want it to be in the blacks. Okay? So I'm okay with this. All right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a screenshot, and I'm going to call this basic panel method. Okay? And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset this. Okay? And we're going to do the edit again, and now we're going to use our second method, which is the tone curve. So one of the things to be mindful of is whenever you move something with a tone curve, we want to ignore this. See that dot that's like grayed out? We want to ignore that dot, and we want to, for measurement sake, we want to see where the black dot is at. Okay? So if I move this and then I were to check something, right? You see, it's not going to land where this was, right? So that's really important to keep in mind. That being said, let's go ahead and jump into this, okay? All right, so with the curve, I find that it's more helpful if I bring my darks into my darker part first whenever I have an overexposed picture, and then worry about the brighter parts, okay? So I know that I want this tree to go into the blacks, in the black grid. So I'm going to bring this down, okay? I'm going to look, measure, and you see the black dot is in the blacks, okay? I'm going to look here, and I'm going to bring her shirt a little bit lower. Let me measure it. Yeah, I mean, it's good there. Okay, so already this looks pretty good. I've only done two parts here. I'm going to look at her hair, and her hair is in the whites, but it's not clipping. I'm going to look at her skin, and her skin is right where the other one was, but maybe let's try going a little brighter on this one. So let me just bring this up a tiny little bit. Okay, and now let me look at it. Yep, and so we're in this section here, okay? You know, one of the things that you could do, sometimes I do this, I don't necessarily need to do it now. If this was a little bit closer here, then I would lift up the shadows a little bit. And then here we're clipping, so I'm going to bring this down a little bit, just a tiny little bit, just so that it's not clipping, okay? So in Lightroom, if you hit the Option key and then you bring down any point in the tone curve, it'll bring it down really slowly. Okay, so this is the second example. So I'm going to screenshot this or make a snapshot, and I'm going to call this tone curve method. And you can see how this affects your colors. It creates more like contrast in the colors. But let's stick to the black and white. All right, so I'm going to reset this. Okay, where's my tone curve here? Okay, so I'm going to reset this. And now what we're going to do is I'm going to share with you the difference between these two different methods, okay? So here is the basic panel method, and here is the tone curve method, right? So they're slightly different. And I typically, when I want a more 3D look, I will use the tone curve method. And whenever I want a photograph to have lower contrast, I use the basic panel method, especially if I'm going to take it into Photoshop. If I'm going to do color toning, I will usually use the basic panel method. This video is obviously not about color, but yeah, I will usually use the basic panel method for my color work as I prepare it to go into Photoshop, and then I will use my tone curve method if I'm only going to do it in Lightroom, or even if I'm going to bring it into Photoshop and I don't really want to add contrast in Photoshop, I will just use this, okay? So that is the second method. Now, what I want to share with you now is how to use both, okay? Because sometimes, you know, that works as well. So for example, here, I look at her skin tone and I'm like, that's great. And I'm looking here and I'm like, I want to bring this down and I want to bring this down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my blacks down a tiny little bit, and my shadows a tiny little bit. And as you can see, we're clipping a little bit. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump over to the curves, and I'm going to lift this a tiny little bit so that it does not clip. And I'm going to lower this a tiny little bit so that it does not clip. And then the rest, my contrast, I'm going to add it in my curves. So I'm going to look here. And I'm okay with her skin tone there, but for now, I think I'm going to raise it, and I want to bring it right about to the middle of this grid here. So I am going to click here, and I'm going to bring it right up about to the middle. And then I'm going to check here, and the contour on her face, I want to lower a little bit. So I'm going to bring the contour just a tiny little bit. And let's check here, and maybe these shadows a tiny little bit here as well. Okay, and what else? Let me just measure again. Okay, so do we have anything clipping? This side, I don't think I'm going to be able to fix this. I could lower this a tiny bit more. Okay, and yeah, I mean, I'd be happy with that. And this is what it looks like without black and white. And I could definitely take this into Photoshop and finish the process there. Okay, so I'm going to do this, and I'm going to call this the combo method. I mean, these methods don't really exist. I don't know if I've never heard of them before. I'm just kind of making it up as I go. What's important is that you realize the importance of where you put your tone. So if you look here, you could see that they're slightly different, okay? Because I put my tones in slightly different places, okay? And the curves, for whatever reason, tends to give it a more 3D-like contrast as to where the basic panel is a little bit more flat, okay? So now you have these three different ones, okay? And that is how you do that. Okay, so I wanna give a quick disclaimer before we move on into Photoshop. If you look and you're like, oh, he's putting his subject's forehead in this section here, and the shirt down in the blacks, and then the contours right in this section here, I'm gonna do that too. But you like bright and airy pictures, like those wedding pictures that are like really bright and airy and pastel, it's not gonna work for you. It's not a matter of copying exactly my settings, it's a matter of studying the photographs that you like to see where your favorite photographs, where those tones are residing. And that will create the kind of contrast that you like. It'll create the style that you like, or at least it'll approximate it. And then with time, you'll get better. So for me, I'm still new at this method. So I'm getting better every day. And as I continue to use it, I will continue to improve. And so that's kind of the concept or the disclaimer that I want to give you. It's not a matter of copying and putting your tones in these specific zones, but rather studying for yourself so that you can determine which zones you want to put your photographs in. All right, so this could be enough. This would be enough. I'd be happy with that. But let's say that I want to take it into Photoshop. That's what I'm going to do now. And I'm going to share with you just some bonus tricks, some bonus hacks. And we will be using the curves in Photoshop. So you notice that I brought it into Photoshop and I brought it into color. Okay, and